fascinating about photography is that the underlying principles of taking a picture are actually quite simple. And yet, with the same camera, just adjusting a few little settings, you can get a widely different image looking at the same exact scenery. Now, I myself have a DSLR camera. It looks something like this. It's really bulky. Does anybody else have one? Raise your hand if you have a DSLR. Okay, so a couple of people. Now, what I'm going to talk about to you today does not just apply to these fancy cameras. Even the simple point-and-shoot camera will have manual settings that you can use. And I hope after today's presentation, you'll feel more comfortable getting out of that auto mode and being more creative with the pictures. So the two things I'll talk about are aperture and shutter speed. Two very related concepts, and two that are quite simple. So aperture is just a fancy word for a hole. A hole that lets the light through. And every camera has this. It looks something like this. You can have a narrow aperture or wide aperture, depending on the effect you want to achieve. Now, what does it actually control? What difference does it make to your image to have a narrow aperture or wide aperture? Well, let me give you an example. Here's a picture I took last night. You'll notice that here, you can see all of the detail very clearly. You can see every fiber on the ball at the front, and you can see quite sharply the background. This picture was taken with a narrow aperture. The smaller your hole, or the aperture, the more detail you'll get in your foreground, in the thing you're trying to take a picture of, and your background. Now, if I wanted to focus your attention on this glass ball, the ball with the two paws on it, then what I would do is I would expand the aperture, make the hole much bigger, and I'll get something like this. Now the foreground is blurred, the background is kind of blurry, and all of your attention goes directly to that one thing that I want you to focus on. And that is the effect of aperture. Wider aperture, more blur in the foreground and background, more narrow aperture will give you detail along all of your picture. So that's the whole. Now before I move on to shutter speed, I want you to think in your mind of that classic noise that a camera makes. It's something like, ch-ch. You know what I'm talking about? I can't quite do the noise, I'm not very vocal. But that noise is actually aperture opening up and closing. And the time that it stays open is called shutter speed. The amount of the time that the hole is open. So the longer you open the aperture, the more light will get through. The less time, the smaller the shutter speed, the less light will get through. Now I'll give you a couple of examples. Actually, 3 examples. And what I did for these is I took that same tennis ball and I dropped it. And as it was falling, I took a picture of it. And I left the aperture the same size, but I adjusted the shutter speed. So in this first picture, the aperture was open for 1/10 of a second. It's pretty fast, but in that time, the ball has actually traveled quite a bit. And so you see that the ball is clearly in motion, but you can't quite tell that it's a ball, it's unclear, it's really bright. Here's a picture where the aperture was open for 1/100th of a second. So now you can start to feel that it's actually a tennis ball, and it's falling, or moving in some sense. And here's a picture where the shutter speed was 1/5000th of a second. You can see the difference. Here it looks like the ball is actually levitating in midair. It's kind of cool. With this one setting, with the shutter speed, you can actually freeze time. Now to bring the ideas of aperture and shutter speed together, I want you to pay attention to what's different between these 3 images. I mean, there is the blur of the ball. It's clearly different. But what else is different? Sure, Kat.
So classic. The background is blurrier in the one where you can clearly see the ball.
That's right. only have time for one answer. The background is blurry here, and it's sharper over here. Now, another thing to note is that the very first picture is very bright. The third picture is much darker. Why is that? Now, I told you that I left the aperture at the same size. But with the third picture, the aperture was open for only 1/1000th of that time in the first picture. So in the first one, much more light gets through. And that's why you see it's so much brighter. And you can also see all of the detail of the background. Whereas in the last picture, the light that got through wasn't a lot. So the background is kind of blurry, and overall, it's darker. So there you have it, two simple concepts, aperture and shutter speed, that when adjusted, can give you a lot more creativity in your pictures. So I hope now you'll feel more comfortable switching off that auto mode on whatever camera you have, and trying to experiment more with what photography can do, and thus get more creative with your picture taking. Thank you very much.